The year is 1645. England is bleeding. Brother fights brother in a brutal civil war, and the king's law has crumbled into dust. In this chaos, a man rides into the sleepy villages of East Anglia. He wears a broad-brimmed hat, a heavy cloak, and carries a terrifying title he gave himself, the Witchfinder General. He claims to be God's agent, sent to root out the devil's servants. But where he walks, he leaves only silence, empty homes, and the ashes of the innocent. He sent 300 souls to the gallows in just 2 years. But the question remains, was he a fanatic, a con man, or a monster created by the madness of his time? Tonight, we follow the bloody footprints of Matthew Hopkins. Welcome back to Overnight Historian, where the past is always awake. Tonight, we are stepping into the paranoia of the 17th century to meet the most infamous serial killer in British judicial history. This is the story of how fear was turned into a business and how one man held an entire country hostage with nothing but a pointing finger. If you are ready to walk through the fog of history with us, please subscribe and ring the bell. Lie back, take a deep breath, and let's travel to a time when a knock on the door could mean the end of your life. To understand the rise of Matthew Hopkins, we must first look at the world that created him. The mid-17th century was perhaps the darkest period in English history. The English Civil War was raging, tearing the country apart. It was Parliament against the king, Roundhead against Cavalier. The traditional structures of authority, the courts, the judges, the bishops, had collapsed. In the countryside, there was no law. Soldiers roamed the roads, crops failed, and a deep, gnawing anxiety settled over the population. People believed that these calamities were not just political, they were spiritual. They believed that God was angry and that the devil was walking freely among them, taking advantage of the chaos to snare souls. It was into this power vacuum that Matthew Hopkins stepped. He was a young man, only in his mid-20s, the son of a Puritan minister. Little is known of his early life, but it is believed he tried his hand at the law and failed. He was a nobody, a man without status or fortune, living in the small Essex town of Manningtree. But Hopkins possessed a dangerous talent. He knew how to listen to the fears of his neighbors. In Manningtree, as in every village, there were whispers. People spoke of sick cows, of milk turning sour, of sudden pains in the night. They blamed the old, the poor, and the eccentric. Hopkins listened, and he saw an opportunity. The room smelled of stale sweat, fear, and burning tallow. Hopkins sat in the corner, a silent predator, noting every twitch, every mutter. He was not alone. He had been joined by a man who would become his brutal right hand, John Sturm. Together, they watched the widow disintegrate. By the third night, the line between reality and nightmare had vanished for Elizabeth Clarke. The flickering shadows cast by the candlelight began to take shapes. The scratching of a mouse in the wainscoting sounded like a demon's whisper. Hopkins leaned in, his voice a low, insistent drone. He asked her about her children. He asked her who comforted her in the lonely nights. He asked to see them. Broken, delirious, and desperate to please her captors just to be allowed to close her eyes, Elizabeth Clarke began to speak. She whispered that yes, she was not alone. She told them that she had familiars, spirits that she fed with her own blood. And then, in a moment of theatrical horror that would be recorded in pamphlets across England, she introduced them. Hopkins claimed that as they watched, the familiars actually appeared in the room. First came a white creature, like a kitten, but not quite a kitten, which she called Holt. Then came a fat, spaniel-like creature with short legs waddling from the shadows, which she named Jarmara. But the creatures grew stranger and more grotesque as the night deepened. Elizabeth spoke of Vinegar Tom, a being that appeared as a greyhound with long, spindly legs, but possessing the head of an ox with broad horns. She spoke of Sack and Sugar, a black rabbit that demanded to be fed. To the modern mind, these sound like the hallucinations of a woman driven to the brink of psychosis by sleep deprivation. But to Hopkins and Stern, scratching furiously in their notebooks, this was legal proof. They were seeing the armies of hell manifesting in a dusty room in Manningtree. They believed that these creatures were demons, suckling at the witch's marks on Elizabeth's body. The confession of Elizabeth Clarke was the key that unlocked the floodgates. She did not just condemn herself. Under further pressure, she began to name others. She named her own daughter, Rebecca West. She named neighbors she had argued with, rivals she envied, and women she simply knew. The web of accusations spun outward from that single room, ensnaring the women of the surrounding villages. Hopkins emerged from that house not as a man who had tortured a senile widow, but as a hero who had stared down monsters. He had proven the existence of the plot. The art of discovery had been perfected. With Elizabeth Clarke's confession in hand, Hopkins and Stern realized they had struck a vein of gold. There were witches everywhere, they claimed, and only they possessed the unique skill to find them. The one-legged widow was dragged to the dungeon, but for the Witchfinder General, the work was just beginning. The hunt was no longer a local curiosity. It was about to become a plague. With the confession of Elizabeth Clarke secured and the names of her accomplices in hand, Matthew Hopkins realized that he had stumbled upon something far more potent than simple local fame. He had discovered a business model. Until this moment, witch trials in England had been sporadic, local affairs, usually driven by neighborly disputes. But Hopkins saw the potential for an industry. He formalized his partnership with John Stern, a man who lacked Hopkins' smooth tongue but made up for it with a brutal, imposing physical presence. Together, they became a traveling company of death. They styled themselves as the Witchfinder General and his associates, printing pamphlets that advertised their unique skills in detecting the agents of Satan. They did not work for free, but they were cunning enough not to demand a king's ransom up front. They charged a standard fee to any town that requested their services, 20 shillings. To the modern ear, 20 shillings, or £1, might sound like a pittance, but in 1645 it was a significant sum, roughly a month's wages for a laborer. Moreover, this was just the retainer. The towns were also expected to pay for the witchfinders' travel, their lodging, their food, and the expenses of their watchers. The cost of finding witches began to bleed the coffers of East Anglia dry, yet town councils paid it willingly. The fear that Hopkins had stoked was so intense that magistrates believed they were paying for spiritual sanitation. They were hiring exterminators to clear their villages of a demonic infestation. The 20-shilling terror swept across the counties of Essex, Suffolk, and Norfolk like a fever. No village was too small, no hamlet too remote. When the witchfinder's carriage rattled into town, a collective shudder would pass through the community. Everyone knew that before he left, women would die. Hopkins and Stern honed their efficiency. They could no longer spend days watching a single woman, so they expanded their repertoire of tests. They revived an ancient and barbaric practice, the swimming test. The theory was simple and twisted. Water was a pure element used in holy baptism, and therefore it would reject anyone who had renounced their baptism to serve the devil. The suspect would be bound, right thumb to left toe, left thumb to right toe, and tossed into a pond or river. If they sank, they were innocent, and hopefully pulled out before they drowned. If they floated, the water was rejecting them, and they were guilty. It was a spectacle that drew crowds in the thousands, turning the somber business of justice into a grotesque carnival. But as Hopkins' arrogance grew, so did his targets. He began to reach higher than the poor and the destitute. He turned his gaze toward the church itself. In the village of Brandeston in Suffolk lived an 80-year-old vicar named John Lowes. Reverend Lowes was a cantankerous man, known for his combative nature and his decades-long feuds with his parishioners. In normal times, he would have been merely a disliked old priest, but in the time of the Witchfinder, unpopularity was a death sentence. Hopkins accused the vicar of witchcraft. It was a shocking claim, a man of God in league with the devil. But Hopkins was unstoppable. He subjected the frail 80-year-old man to the watching. They forced the vicar to walk. They kept him awake for days until his mind snapped. Under the duress of exhaustion, the old man's resistance crumbled. He confessed to having a familiar named Tom and admitted to sinking a ship off the coast of Harwich, killing 14 people. It was a ludicrous confession, born of delirium, but it was enough. Reverend Lowes was denied a proper trial by his peers. Instead, he was subjected to the swimming test in the castle moat at Framlingham. He floated. The crowd cheered, seeing the proof bobbing on the surface of the water. The vicar was condemned. As he was led to the gallows, he recited his own burial service, a final act of defiance from a man abandoned by his flock. The execution of a clergyman sent a chilling message across England. Absolutely no one was safe. The Witchfinder General was no longer just a servant of the law. He had become the law. But in his hubris, Hopkins had pushed too far. He did not know it yet, but the sight of an 80-year-old priest hanging from the gallows was stirring a quiet rage in the hearts of sensible men, a rage that would soon turn the hunter into the hunted. By the summer of 1646, the shadow of Matthew Hopkins had stretched long and dark across the counties of East Anglia. In just over a year, the self-proclaimed Witchfinder General and his partner John Stern had overseen the execution of nearly 300 people. The jails of Ipswich, Bury St. Edmunds, and Chelmsford were overflowing with the accused, huddled in filth, waiting for the swimming or the rope. But as the leaves began to turn in the autumn of that bloody year, something else began to change. The fever of hysteria that had gripped the populace began to break, replaced by a cold, sobering dawn of realization. The first cracks in Hopkins' empire were financial. The 20-shilling terror was proving too expensive for the war-weary towns to bear. While the initial fee of 20 shillings seemed manageable, the hidden costs were bankrupting local councils. They had to pay for the lodging of Hopkins and his entourage in the finest inns. They had to pay for the guards to watch the prisoners day and night. They had to pay for the ale and meat consumed during the interrogations. In the town of Aldborough, the cost of the witch trials consumed 1/7 of the town's entire annual budget. Magistrates looked at their ledgers and realized they were paying a fortune to hang their own neighbors. The sanitation service Hopkins provided was bleeding them dry. But the resistance was not just economic, it was moral. The sight of the elderly Vicar Lowes floating in the moat had shaken the conscience of the educated class. Men of influence began to ask uncomfortable questions. Was it right to torture the old and the senile until they confessed to impossible things? Was swimming a suspect not just a pagan ritual disguised as justice? The absolute certainty that Hopkins projected began to look less like divine inspiration and more like tyranny. The voice of this growing resistance came from an unexpected quarter. In the village of Great Staunton in Huntingdonshire lived a minister named John Gowell. Unlike the frightened clergy who had bowed to Hopkins, Gowell was a man of fierce intellect and immense courage. He had heard that the Witchfinder was planning to visit his parish, and instead of trembling, Gowell decided to fight back. He did not deny the existence of witches. He was a man of the 17th century, after all, but he vehemently denied Matthew Hopkins' authority to find them. Gowell took up his pen, a weapon sharper than any pin used to prick for the devil's mark. He wrote a scathing pamphlet titled "Select Cases of Conscience Touching Witches and Witchcraft." In it, he dismantled Hopkins' methods piece by piece. He condemned the practice of watching, calling it exactly what it was, torture by sleeplessness. He attacked the swimming test as unchristian and superstitious, but his most damning accusation was directed at Hopkins himself. Gowell painted the Witchfinder not as a holy warrior, but as a presumptuous amateur who had usurped the power of God and the king's judges. He asked the public, "By what authority does this man walk into our towns and demand the lives of our citizens?" The pamphlet spread quickly. It was read in taverns, in market squares, and most importantly, in the judges' chambers. The tide was turning. Hopkins, who had ridden the wave of popular fear for 2 years, suddenly found himself on the defensive.
He was no longer greeted with cheers and open gates. In Norfolk, he was met with hostile questions. Judges began to demand real evidence, not just the delirious ramblings of sleep-deprived widows.
Sensing his power slipping away, Hopkins wrote a letter to the judges of the Norfolk Assizes. It remains one of the few documents we have in his own hand, and it reeks of desperation and wounded pride. He wrote, "I intend to give your town a visit suddenly. I am to come to Kimbleton this week, and it shall be 10-1, but I will come to your town first." But then he adds a telling condition. "But I would certainly know whether you are willing to give me a welcome and entertainment." The arrogance was still there, but beneath it was fear. The Witchfinder was asking for permission. He was asking if he was still wanted. He received his answer in the cold stares of the townsfolk and the closed doors of the courts. The Witchfinder General had overplayed his hand. The hysteria was fading, leaving behind a landscape scarred by gallows and grief. Hopkins retreated to Manningtree, his pockets full of blood money, but his reputation in tatters. The hunter was losing his hunting grounds. And as the winter of 1647 approached, the shadows he had cast over others began to lengthen over his own life. The end was coming, not with a bang, but with the coughing sickness that was slowly consuming his lungs. The winter of 1647 brought a chill to the bones of East Anglia, a cold that seemed to seep from the very earth where so many innocent bodies had been buried in unconsecrated ground. In the quiet village of Manningtree, the man who had once ridden through the streets like a conquering king now lay confined to his bed. Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, was dying. He was only 27 years old. The shadow that had terrified a nation had shrunk to the size of a sick room, smelling of medicinal herbs and the metallic tang of blood. The fearsome voice that had bullied confessions from the exhausted and the weak was now reduced to a hacking, wet cough. Consumption, or tuberculosis as we know it now, was consuming his lungs, a slow and suffocating execution that no amount of gold could bribe away. History tells us that Hopkins died in his bed, likely in the month of August. It was a quiet, anticlimactic end for a man who had built his life on spectacle. There were no crowds to cheer his passing, no judges to read his sentence. He was buried in the graveyard of the Church of St. Mary at Mistley Heath. The parish register records his burial simply, Matthew Hopkins, son of Mr. James Hopkins, minister. There is no mention of his title, no mention of the 300 lives he extinguished. In the end, the earth accepted him just as it had accepted his victims, silently and without distinction. For a man who sought immortality through infamy, this anonymity was perhaps the cruelest fate of all. But the people of England were not satisfied with such a mundane ending. They had lived through the terror of the Witchfinder, and they demanded a finale that felt like justice. And so, as the years passed, a legend began to grow. A ghost story whispered in the taverns of Essex that became more powerful than the truth. The story went that the hunter had become the hunted. People said that a group of angry villagers, pushed too far by his tyranny, had dragged Hopkins from his home. They claimed that he was taken to the local pond, bound thumb to toe just as he had bound so many others, and subjected to his own swimming test. In this grim folklore, the Witchfinder floated. The water rejected him, proving by his own twisted logic that he was a wizard in league with the devil. The legend says that the mob then dragged him to the nearest tree and hanged him, giving him a taste of the medicine he had forced down the throat of the country. This version of events was immortalized in Samuel Butler's satirical poem Hudibras, cementing the image of Hopkins hoisting himself on his own petard. While there is no historical evidence to support this violent end, it survives because it offers us the poetic justice we crave. We want to believe that monsters pay for their crimes, that the scales of the universe balance themselves out in the end. With Hopkins gone, the fever broke. His partner, John Stern, attempted to continue the work, but without the charismatic zeal of Hopkins, the business collapsed.
Sterne retired to a quiet life, writing a defensive book trying to justify their actions before dying in obscurity. The Civil War eventually ended, the courts were restored, and the witch-hunting mania of the 1640s faded into a dark memory. But the scars remained. In the villages of East Anglia, there were empty chairs at tables and unmarked graves in the fields. The trust between neighbors had been shattered, replaced by a lingering suspicion that would take generations to heal.
Matthew Hopkins remains a terrifying enigma. Was he a true believer, a man who genuinely thought he was doing God's work by cleansing the land of evil? Or was he a cynical con man, a failed lawyer who saw a way to get rich and powerful by exploiting the fears of a war-torn nation? Perhaps he was a bit of both, a man who told a lie so big that he eventually began to believe it himself. He taught us a lesson that echoes down through the centuries, that evil does not always look like a demon with horns. Sometimes it looks like a well-dressed man with a book of laws, pointing a finger at the weak and saying, "I am here to protect you." And so the book closes on the Witchfinder General. The moors of East Anglia are quiet now, and the water in the village ponds is still. But the story of Matthew Hopkins stands as a monument to the dangers of fanaticism and fear. He walked through history like a nightmare, and like all nightmares, he eventually faded with the morning light. If this journey into the darkest chapter of British history has kept you captivated, or helped you find a strange comfort in the safety of the present, please subscribe to Overnight Historian. We have many more stories waiting in the dark, from the vampire panic of New England to the cursed diamonds of the French crown. Join us next time as we turn the page to a new mystery. Until then, sleep well, and remember, history is watching. Good night.